Today we scroll past a power outage without blinking. But in 42, darkness didn't just mean inconvenience. It meant cold floors, empty pans, and a family bracing for the unknown. In the war-torn cities of Europe and beyond, there were no backup grids, no alerts, no emergency deliveries, only silence, broken by distant sirens or the hiss of a makeshift stove. Back then, tools weren't chosen. They were clung to, not for comfort, survival. A rusted hand pump that drew water from deep earth. A soot-blackened stove burning salvaged wax. A wool blanket nailed across a shattered window to keep the frost out. They weren't fancy. They weren't modern, but they work. Without electricity, without fuel trucks, without permission. Because they were built for collapse. And collapse had come. Most of us today wouldn't finally recognize them. We've traded durability for convenience and forgotten what it means to stand alone. But these tools, the real ones, are still out there, buried in sheds and rusting in barns, waiting in basements. And if the lights go out for good, it won't be the newest tool that saves. It'll be the oldest one you remembered to keep. If you're still listening, you already know why this matters. Subscribe and never depend on the system again. Number 1. Paraffin stoves. When cities lost gas during bombing raids, families lost their kitchen. The hum of everyday life, tea boiling, bread toasting, water warming, fell silent overnight. But hunger didn't wait for repairs. It demanded fire. Electric cookers were useless. Wood was scarce in urban neighborhoods. Coal was rationed and tightly controlled. In this vacuum, one device quietly stepped forward: the paraffin stove. Often battered, blackened, and smelling faintly of fuel, these stoves burned liquid paraffin, also known as kerosene, drawn from hidden tins stored under floorboards or wrapped in oilcloth beneath beds. They were small, portable, and deadly serious. A simple wick and flame design made them easy to use even in pitch dark. Some families placed bricks around them to create makeshift ovens. Others used old grill racks salvaged from bombed-out buildings. With just a few ounces of fuel, a mother could boil water, heat soup, or cook wartime bread substitute from powdered potato and flour. Unlike wood-burning hearths, paraffin stoves didn't rely on outdoor resources. They worked indoors, in basements, in shelters, in cramped apartments where smoke was dangerous and space was limited. They produced minimal soot. They were silent, and they got the job done. But they weren't perfect. Paraffin fumes were toxic in closed spaces. Children were taught to stay away. Ventilation was critical, and accidents were common in the early months and fuel had to be stored carefully. One leak could ruin everything. Despite their hazards, these stoves became the beating heart of the home. Morning tea, evening stews, warm cloths soaked to clean babies when water lines failed. All of it, one blue flame at a time. In post-war years, they disappeared, replaced by polished appliances and instant ignition. But for those who remember, the smell of paraffin carries something more than nostalgia. It smells like survival. Today, most homes have no backup way to boil water or cook food without power. If the grid failed tomorrow, how many would know what to... Because in a world that assumes the system will hold, it's the families who prepare for silence that last the longest. Would you keep one in your home today? Or has convenience replaced every backup you once had? Number 2. Tin can heaters. When coal ran dry and winter crept in, people didn't wait for rescue. They turned to trash. Empty food tins, discarded by others, overlooked by most, became one of the war's most ingenious heating tools. Inside those rusted cans, civilians built heat. The design was brutally simple. The cardboard was coiled tightly inside the tin. Melted paraffin wax, or leftover candle drippings, were poured in until fully soaked. Once lit, the wickless flame burned slow and steady, radiating heat for hours. They called them buddy burn or tin can heaters, but names didn't matter. What mattered was warmth. These improvised heaters could be made with scraps scavenged from rubble, attics, or emptied pantry. Children were taught how to roll cardboard strips into tight spirals. Mothers melted wax over low flame, pouring it carefully while wearing soot-blackened oven mitts. Each can, once assembled, was set atop fireproof tiles, ready to fight off the cold. In bomb shelters beneath the city, where concrete walls held in the damp, these heaters were a quiet revolution. They dried socks, warmed hands, kept frost off sleeping infants wrapped in old coats. No smoke, no embers, just a silent glow. But the heaters weren't without risk. Paraffin was flammable. Improper construction could lead to flare-ups or wax overflow. Ventilation was critical. Though far safer than coal smoke or open flame, these cans still consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces. Even so, their role was irreplaceable, because in a war zone, there were no thermostat dials, no repairman on call, only a choice: make your own heat or go without. By 1944, entire neighborhoods in colder regions had adopted some form of tin can heating. They were hidden in backpacks during evacuation, stored near beds for quick ignition, sometimes used to cook rationed eggs or warm tea kettles in the absence of a stove. Today, most have forgotten that warmth can come from such simplicity. We expect heat from invisible systems, flipping switches without thinking, but systems fail, supply chains break, and when they do, comfort vanishes fast. A single tin can, prepared in silence, can be the difference between survival and suffering. It's not about being clever, it's about being ready, like millions once were. Would you know how to build one before winter comes? If not, this is your moment to learn, comment, and reclaim the skills the world forgot. Number 3. Victory Garden Kits. When ration lines stretched longer than daylight and food imports were cut by blockades, civilians didn't starve quietly. They planted survival in the soil. The Victory Garden wasn't just propaganda, it was policy turned into action. Across rooftops, alleys, schoolyards, and churchyards, patches of earth became lifelines. But gardening in wartime wasn't guesswork. Civilians received compact kits, simple metal tins or wooden boxes packed with seed packets, basic tools, and illustrated instructions printed on coarse paper. They weren't meant for abundance, they were engineered for yield. Inside each kit, carrots, beets, turnips, cabbage, beans, calorie-dense crops that could grow in poor soil, trowels and pruners forged from salvaged steel, twine made from recycled uniform. Even the packaging was part of the system. Tin lids used to reflect light onto low-growing leaves. In the hands of civilians, these kits became weapons against hunger. They fed families through sieges, bombings, and occupation. They kept children fed when ration stamps ran out and market shelves stood empty. Victory gardens appeared wherever a spade could touch earth, in the cracks between pavement, on rail embankments behind factories, even inside gutted homes, with windowless rooms converted into makeshift greenhouses lit by salvaged glass and ingenuity. But the work was relentless. These were not leisurely gardens. They required planning, daily tending, and hard physical labor. Without fertilizer or commercial tools, families composted everything: eggshells, potato skins, coffee grounds, even human hair for trace minerals. Gardens were mapped seasonally, tracked with wartime calendars. Harvest was timed with precision. Seeds were saved and traded in brown envelopes, passed hand to hand like currency. Still, not every garden thrived. Pests, mold, and frost could undo weeks of work. Water shortages during summer blackouts turned beds to dust. But the discipline paid off, not just in food, but in confidence, because each sprout was a declaration, each tomato a small defiance against dependence. And by 1943, it's estimated that nearly half of Britain's vegetables came from civilian gardens, not from corporations, not from trucks, from hands in soil. Today, gardening is viewed as hobby, but once it was infrastructure, silent, decentralized, resilient. And when the trucks stop rolling again, it won't be frozen dinners that keep you alive. It will be the seed you saved, the tool you cleaned, and the patch you kept ready. If you don't know what grows in your soil, you're already behind. Subscribe and rebuild your food security 1 square foot at a time at AE. Number 4, hand crank radios. When the power failed, so did the news. And in wartime, silence wasn't safety. It was danger without direction. Civilian life depended on information, where the next air raid might fall, which street had clean water, when to evacuate, when to hide, when to hope. But radios powered by wall sockets were useless during blackouts. Batteries were rationed, hoarded, and in many cases, impossible to find. So people turned to something older, something mechanical, the hand crank radio. It didn't need a plug, it didn't need batteries. All it needed was movement, a steady turn of the handle to generate power, charge the internal capacitor, and bring the broadcast to life. Families gathered around these radios in dark cellars and shuttered kitchens. The static would hiss, then settle, and the distant voice of a government official or coded broadcast would fill the room. Not entertainment, but instruction, orders, warnings. Some models were factory-made, issued by civil defense programs. Others were civilian-built, hacked together from scavenged coils, copper, and salvaged parts from broken sets. They weren't pretty, but they worked. A 5-minute crank could power 10 minutes of reception, long enough to hear if the bombers had passed, if the roads were safe, if ration books were being reissued that week. The value of these radios went beyond communication. They restored a sense of control. When everything else felt like chaos, turning a handle and hearing a signal reminded people they weren't cut off. Not completely, but these tools weren't invincible. If a part failed, replacements were scarce, transmission towers were bombed, frequencies jammed, and in the worst zones, no broadcast came at all. Still, people kept turning the crank, every night, just in case. Today, most of us check news on glowing screens powered by fragile grids. We swipe for headlines, assuming the signal will always be there. But when it goes dark, and stays dark, will you have a way to hear what comes next? The hand crank radio isn't a relic. It's for a time when the only signal that matters is the one you made yourself. Would you remember the frequency when it counts? Or would you sit in silence, hoping someone else kept listening? Subscribe and never lose the signal again. Number 5. Wool blankets and blackout curtains. When winter descended and bombs followed nightfall, survival came down to two things: warmth and concealment. In most homes, central heating was a luxury, or non-existent. Fuel was rationed, coal deliveries unreliable, and fireplaces reserved for cooking or the sick. But cold didn't wait. It crept in through shattered panes and broken roof lines. And light, even a single flicker from a candle, could invite death from above. Civilians turned to two tools that never made headlines, but often made the difference: thick wool blankets and blackout curtains. Wool blankets weren't just for beds. They were nailed over doorways to block drafts, hung over windows to stop heat loss, laid across floors to seal gaps where wind snuck through bomb-damaged walls. Wool retained heat even when damp, a critical advantage when roofs leaked and walls sweated with condensation. Children slept wrapped like bundles on the floor, cocooned in layers of wool and salvaged cloth. At night, families huddled in one room to preserve body heat, blankets lining the walls like insulation. But warmth was only half the battle. During air raids, any light escaping a window could draw attention from enemy bombers. One slip, a forgotten lamp, a cracked curtain, could mark a home for destruction. That's where blackout curtains came in. Made from heavy, dark fabric, tar paper, or salvaged upholstery, these curtains were mandatory by law. Wardens patrolled neighborhoods, shouting warnings or issuing fines for visible light. Civilians got creative. Some used doubled-up blankets. Others painted windows with dark paint or used cardboard inserts lined with soot. At nightfall, homes transformed into sealed chambers, not just to preserve warmth, but to vanish from the sky. There were no second chances. One uncovered window could end an entire street. Installing and maintaining these coverings became part of daily routine. Before dusk, curtains drawn, blankets checked, every crack covered. Even lanterns were shaded with makeshift hoods to reduce glare. The results were invisible, and that was the point. Entire cities disappeared each night, swallowed by darkness that protected them. Today, blackout curtains are sold for sleep. Wool blankets are folded for guests. But once, they were frontline defenses in a war without battlefields. In a grid-down world, warmth and invisibility are more than comfort. They're survival, because when the cold comes and the lights go out, the question won't be how much tech you own. It'll be how well you can disappear. Would your home vanish into the dark tonight, or would your windows glow like targets? Number 6. Coal scuttles and ash sieves. In wartime cities, fuel wasn't just scarce, it was sacred. Coal rationing stripped homes of their primary heat source. And when allocations ran out, there was no waiting list, no extensions, only cold. But even in scarcity, civilians found supply where others saw waste. They turned to the hearth, not for comfort, but for remains. And with coal scuttles and ash sieves, they learned to reclaim what the fire left behind. After each burn, families collected the cooled ashes from their stoves and grates. Gray, powdery heaps, at first glance, useless. But buried inside were fragments of unburned coal, slivers too small to notice, chunks too weak to ignite fully the first time. Ash sieves, built from metal mesh fitted into salvaged wood frames, became daily tools. Civilians would slowly pour their stove ash into the sieve, shaking gently, letting the fine powder fall below while capturing larger remnants above. The results were saved in coal scuttles, lidded containers traditionally used to feed the fire, now repurposed to stretch every ounce of usable fuel. These partial coals, once dismissed, were dried near the stove and reused for secondary burns. Some sieved twice. Others mixed coal dust with potato starch or animal fat to form briquettes, small, dense lumps pressed by hand and dried over days. It was labor-intensive, messy, and entirely necessary. Children were taught the ritual early. Sweep the hearth. Sift with care, store what burns. Every fragment mattered. On bitter nights, that extra handful of recovered coal could warm a room for an hour, boil water for tea, keep pipes from freezing, or simply take the edge off the cold that clawed through shuttered homes. But even this process had limits. Ash inhalation was dangerous, especially in cramped kitchens and unventilated rooms. Mesh wore down. Splinters caught fingers. And in homes damaged by bombing, sieving ash in unstable rooms became a risk unto itself. Still, civilians persisted because the alternative was colder. And defeat in war or winter begins when you stop trying. By 1943, ash sieves became common household items. Not bought, but built. Neighbors traded screen wire. Tin snips became tools of survival. And coal scuttles were guarded with quiet seriousness. This wasn't innovation. It was memory. A return to methods once known, long buried under convenience. Today, when fuel prices spike, we complain. But few have touched a sieve. Fewer still know the smell of reused coal, or understand how warmth once came from ashes. The lesson isn't about fire, it's about discipline. The kind that makes something from nothing. Because in a world where everything is disposable, only those who reclaim what's left will endure the longest. Would you know what still burns in your own waste? Or would you throw survival into the bin? Number 7, manual water pumps. When the taps ran dry, the thirst came fast. Not just for drinking, but for cooking, washing, sanitation. Clean water is the quiet backbone of civilization. And in war, it was the first to collapse. Bombing raids shattered mains beneath roads. Water towers were drained. Pipes froze in winter or burst from neglect. Suddenly, homes once fed by steady pressure found only silence at the faucet. Civilians needed an answer, not in weeks, but in hours. And for many, that answer came from below, the manual water pump. Usually ignored or rusting before the war, these hand-operated devices became critical infrastructure overnight. Fitted over wells or underground cisterns, they used simple suction and lever mechanisms to pull groundwater to the surface. No wires, no fuel, just steel, muscle, and time. In rural villages, pumps had never disappeared. But in towns and cities, they had to be found, unearthed in gardens, old courtyards, or municipal storage. Some were mounted in cobbled squares. Others stood hidden behind collapsed walls. Civilians cleaned them, repaired seals, replaced leathers, and oiled joints stiff with disuse. Each pump became a local resource. Lines formed at dawn, Buckets, cans, bottles, kettles. Families walked miles to draw water, sometimes twice a day, guarding their share with quiet vigilance. But water from pumps wasn't always safe. Flooded pipes could carry contamination. Stagnant cisterns bred bacteria. So people boiled every drop before using it, on paraffin stoves or tin heaters if they had them. Those without took chances. Some civilians filtered water through sand and charcoal-filled socks. Others built slow-drip systems using cloth funnels and gravel scavenged from roads. Every drop mattered. Every method counted, and still, the pump endured. It didn't care about outages, didn't depend on pressure zones or municipal valves. It worked through siege, frost, blackout, and neglect. But it demanded work in return. One person could spend 15 minutes drawing 10 liters. Arms ached, handles jammed, and in winter, the metal bit skin through thin gloves. Yet no one abandoned it, because this tool wasn't optional. By 1944, some neighborhoods installed communal pump schedules. Local wardens oversaw maintenance. Children carried water home in tin pails balanced on sticks across their shoulders. It wasn't efficient, but it kept people alive. Today, most homes don't know where their water comes from, much less how to find it if the flow stops. Modern pumps rely on electricity. Filters need pressure. Storage is minimal. But when everything fails, the tool that needs no grid still delivers. It doesn't glow, it doesn't beep, it simply works. Because survival has never depended on technology. It depends on access. Would you know how to draw water if the system shut down? Or would you wait empty-handed for a truck that never comes? Subscribe and rebuild your resilience one drop at a time. They didn't call themselves preppers. They didn't post about resilience or self-sufficiency. They just did what was necessary because no one else was coming. Vanuatu civilians weren't trained survivalists. They were ordinary people, mothers, pensioners, children, who adapted under pressure most today can't even imagine. They boiled nettles before their hands cracked from cold. They rationed light the way we ration time. And when systems failed, they didn't protest. They got to work. Their survival didn't come from strength. It came from tools, simple, often homemade, passed between generations like whispered knowledge. Not tactical, not digital, but dependable when nothing else was. Each item in this list was once just part of daily life. A blanket nailed to a window, a pump squeaking in the cold, a seed pushed into ruined soil. But behind every tool was a deeper principle, self-reliance in its purest form. They didn't wait for rescue. They became their own infrastructure. And they didn't learn from books or theories. They learned by fire, frost, and blackout. Today, we live in a world that runs on invisible systems. We assume food will arrive, water will flow, power will return, and maybe it will, until it doesn't. Because collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, like it did in 1939, like it did in 1942. Not everywhere at once, just enough to test what you've built. If you depend on comfort, you've already lost. But if you've remembered the old ways, the wartime ways, you're already ahead. Because these tools weren't just about enduring a war. They were about living without the illusion of control. And that's what real preparation means. Not fear, not panic, but readiness without noise. So ask yourself, what have you put in place that would still work with no electricity? No fuel, no tap, no second chance, because the next blackout won't come with warning. And comfort never taught anyone how to survive. Subscribe now, not for content, but to make sure that when the silence comes, you're not among those left wondering what to do next.